Without further ado, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce to you your United States Senator Bernie Sanders.
Thank you. Whoa, this is an incredible crowd. Thank God the weather was not nice tonight. We surely would have run out of food. Thank you all very much for coming out. I'm going to chat for a few hours, a little while, and then we'll open it up to questions and comments. So let me begin by reiterating what Phil just said. I think this is our 40th meeting around the state. Why do we do these meetings? And the answer is that I would 1,000 times prefer to put money in bringing people in our state together than doing ugly 30-second television ads. This country, as you all know, and we're going to discuss in a moment, faces some very, very serious problems, some of the most serious problems since the Great Depression. And as a nation, what we need to do is have thousands of these meetings from one end of this country to the other, so people can come together, ask questions, and figure out how we make this country the kind of country we know it can be. So also, you were kind enough over the years to send me to Washington as the longest-serving independent in the history of the United States Congress. And what that means is that while tonight I'm going to tell you how kind of bad the Republican Party is, and they're pretty bad, you're not going to hear me tell you all, how great the Democrats are. I think we've got to work on them as well. But I think, and I feel confident in saying that the discussion we're going to have tonight, you're not going to hear from any other member of the United States Senate. I'm going to tell you things that you don't see on TV, that you're not going to hear on the floor of the Senate or the House. So let's get to work here. What politics is about ain't complicated. Basically, it's, I think, three things. First of all, it requires an analysis and a discussion of what is going on. What are the problems? And you would be surprised, there's a lot of difference of opinion as to how you analyze what's going on. But that's what we have to do. Second of all, what we have got to discuss is where do we want to go as a nation? What is our vision? Where do we want to be 10 years from now, 20 years from now? I've got 7 grandchildren. What kind of country do you want and I want those kids and your grandchildren to be living in? What is the future? And third is the strategical question of how do we go from A to B? How do we get there? What do we do tomorrow to bring this nation, this state, closer to our own vision? That's kind of the overview of what I'm going to be chatting with you about this evening. Now, in terms of the economy, I'm going to tell you what you already know. And that is that this economy today is in very, very bad shape. Unemployment today is not what you read in the papers at 7.8%. Real unemployment is closer to 15% if you include those people who have given up looking for work who are not included in the statistics, and millions of people in Vermont and elsewhere who are working 20, 30 hours a week when they need and want to work 40 hours a week. So unemployment remains a huge problem. It is worse for young people, kids graduating high school who want to get out in the workforce, young people graduating college, often deeply in debt. Also, what we are seeing, and one of the really heart-wrenching tragedies of our moment, is there are millions of people in this country who have reached the age of 50 and 55, who expected to keep working until they were 65, put a few bucks away in the bank so they could have a dignified retirement. And you know what happened to them? When they reached the age of 55, their employer said, sorry, can't use you anymore. And they bring in somebody who's 25 at half the pay. Millions of people, 50, 55, have lost their jobs. Some of them will never again work, which is not only a terrible blow to their retirement financially, it is an even greater blow to their sense of self-esteem. How would you like to be 50, 55, wanting to work, wanting to be productive, and know that you're never going to have another job in your life. That's going on all over this country. In terms of the economy, what we're seeing is profoundly a middle class disappearing. You all know that this country was once the envy of the world. My father came to this country at the age of 17 without a nickel in his pocket. All over the world, people came to America because it had a dynamic middle class. That middle class is disappearing, and if we don't get our act together, our kids, for the first time in the modern history of America, will have a lower standard of living than we do. And it's not just, just jobs. What's going on is that you have millions of people today. Sometimes we don't talk about it very much. There are people today wondering how they're going to feed their kids tonight, how they're going to pay the light bill, how they're going to pay for $4 a gallon of gas so they can fill up their gas tank in the car and get to work at their $10 an hour job. And if they don't get to work, they're going to lose that job, and their family is going to live in desperation. There are millions of people who had dreamed of being able to save some money, send their kids to college, and they're no longer able to do that. That is the America of today. 22% of our children living in poverty. Millions of seniors not getting the nutrition that they need. All right? Now, when we talk about the economy, the most important question to my mind is one the media discusses very, very rarely, and we don't hear much on the floor of the House and the Senate. It's something I talk about a lot, and that is distribution of wealth and distribution of income. Because at the end of the day, you want to know who's winning, who's losing, how are we doing? In sports, how are the Red Sox doing? Pretty badly. All right. But how are we doing? And so I want to bore you for a moment with some statistics that you're not going to hear in many places. Today in America, in terms of distribution of wealth, there is one family called the Walton family that owns Walmart. That one family owns more wealth than the bottom 40% of the American people. What do you think? One family worth over $100 billion owns more wealth than the bottom 40% of the American people. Another statistic. Today, the top 1% of Americans owns about 42% of the wealth of this nation. Now, that's a pretty startling fact, but I'll give you something that's even more startling. Who wants to guess what the bottom 60% of Americans own? What's the guess? Top 1% owns 42% of the wealth. What do the bottom 60% own? Answer is 2.3%. Okay? That is the reality of American society today. And in terms of distribution of income, that's wealth, what you accumulate in your lifetime. In terms of income, it's not much different. Top 1% earns more income than the bottom 50%. And in the last study that we have seen on this issue, between 2009 and 2010, listen to this, 93% of all of the new income generated over that 1 year went to the top 1%. The bottom 99% of working families were able to enjoy the remaining 7%. And what's startling about that is a lot of economists and politicians talk about, we need economic growth. Well, we do. But in a certain sense, it doesn't matter if almost all of the income generated by economic growth goes to the top 1 or 2%. So in terms of distribution of wealth, we have by far the most unequal distribution of wealth and income of any major country on earth. It is worse today in the United States than at any time since the robber baron age of the 1920s. And that situation, that gap between the very, very rich and everybody else is growing wider and wider. It is a huge, huge issue, very rarely discussed in Washington for reasons that I think you can understand. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Issue number 2, economic power. We'll talk about that for a moment. We are in this horrendous and painful and devastating recession. And by the way, it is hitting Vermont badly, but you don't know what it's like in the rest of the country. because we have the 5th lowest unemployment rate in the United States of America. We are the only state in the last 2 years that has seen some increase in personal income. So if you think it is bad here, which it is, take a look at what's going on in California, Nevada, Midwest, etc. A lot worse. Now, we are in the midst of this recession because of the greed, recklessness, and illegal behavior of the crooks on Wall Street. These guys, over a period of 10 years, spent $5 billion in campaign contributions and lobbying in order to deregulate Wall Street. And I know about that because I served when I was in the House on the Financial Services Committee. And every year, Alan Greenspan, who was then the head of the Fed, would come before us and he would tell us how important it was for us to deregulate Wall Street, to allow investor banks to merge with commercial banks, to merge with insurance companies, so that our financial institutions could be competitive in the global economy. I never believed one word of that. Unfortunately, a majority of my colleagues did, and in a bipartisan way, Republicans and Democrats, signed by Bill Clinton, we deregulated Wall Street, and you know the end of that story. It turns out that these guys were peddling worthless financial tools. They brought our country and the world to the verge of an international financial collapse and a world depression. Okay? Now, 4 years later, this is what is going on. You'll all be delighted to know that 3 out of the 4 largest financial institutions in this country are bigger today than they were before you bailed them out because they were too big to fail. Here's something, again, not talked about terribly often. When you talk about economic power, concentration of ownership, today the largest 6 financial institutions in this country, J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, those 6 have assets equivalent to 2/3 of the gross domestic product of the United States of America. Over $9 trillion controlled by 6 financial institutions. These 6 financial institutions write half of the mortgages, 1/2 of the mortgages in America, and 2/3 of the credit cards. Now, when you have that kind of concentration of ownership, not only is it dangerous to our country because of the incredible power resting in the hands of a handful of folks, hugely powerful people, it is also very, very bad for our economy. Very few people in the United States Congress will be prepared to tell you what I am telling you, but I think if this middle class is to survive and grow, we need to break these financial institutions up. That's what... And I'll give you another example. Another example of financial power. Price of gas in Vermont, which is higher than the rest of the country, just another issue we're working on. Why are you paying $4 or $3.90 for a gallon of gas? Anyone have a clue? People have given up even asking for explanations. Exactly. I mean, if you ask them, well, we're concerned about unrest in the Middle East and it's raining in Putney and a lot of reasons why. When we were in elementary school, we learned about supply and demand, right? More supply, less demand, prices go down. Except if it's in the oil business when prices go up. But what I will also tell you, it's not just the incredible greed and power of ExxonMobil and these guys, who do basically what they want to do. The other issue is, what you may not know, is we have an oil futures market, an energy futures market, where oil futures are sold. Most of you would assume that that market is controlled by people who actually use oil, like airlines, like trucking companies, fuel dealers. Not the case. Over 80% of the energy futures market is controlled by our good friends on Wall Street who are busy speculating and trying to make, and do make, huge profits by buying and selling oil futures. All right? That's called economic power. And when people tell you And you hear this on television, well, you know, we've got to deregulate Wall Street, or Congress has too much power over Wall Street. Let me tell you with 100% certainty that the issue is not Congress regulating Wall Street. It is much more Wall Street regulating and owning the Congress. But I just wanted to touch on what economic power is about. ExxonMobil and these guys can do any damn thing they want, causing havoc. You know, if you're a working person in the state of Vermont, it is not uncommon. You're traveling 20, 30, 50 miles to work and back. $4 a gallon hurts. And these guys could care less. Their profit margin will be enormous, and that's the way it is. Okay. Third point I want to make when we talk about the economic structure of America has to do with the worst Supreme Court decision in the modern history of America. And that is the infamous 5-4 Citizens United decision. A couple of years ago, there were 5 people in the United States of America who believed that a corporation was a person. Unfortunately, they were all on the United States Supreme Court. And they decided that corporations, Bank of America, ExxonMobil, all these nice guys, have the same First Amendment constitutional rights that you have in terms of making campaign contributions. What this means in the real world, some of you know this, some of you don't, that in this campaign right now, you have folks like the Koch brothers who are worth $50 billion that they made in fossil fuel, coal and oil, etc. They have pledged to spend in this campaign against Obama and other candidates $400 million. Got that? One family. Sheldon Adelson, who is a pauper, he's a poor guy, recently gotten off of welfare, and he's only worth $21 billion. And he's going to spend $100 million in this campaign. We documented, my staff documented, over 23 billionaire families. So it's not just Koch brothers and Adelson. 23 separate families who are going to spend at least $250,000 on this campaign. And that, I'm absolutely convinced, is a very conservative number because a lot of this money is spent without any disclosure whatsoever. So the first point that I want to make this evening is if you add up what I've just described to you, an incredible and growing unfair distribution of wealth and income. Number 2, extraordinary economic power in the hands of a few large corporate interests. 3, a Supreme Court decision that said to these same powers, you own coal companies, you own oil companies, you own Wall Street, we are now giving you the opportunity for a relatively modest sum for you guys to own the United States government. All right? Now, you add those 3 things up, what you are looking at is this country moving in a very rapid fashion toward an oligarchic form of society. You all know what I mean by oligarchy? Oligarchy is when you have a society, it may have the trappings of democracy. You know, you may have elections, you may have all this other stuff. But at the end of the day, your political system and your economic system are controlled by a handful of wealthy families. And the challenge, our challenge, not just in this election, but the day after the election, is to work as hard as we can to make sure that this country goes back to its democratic foundations, one person, one vote, and not move to this type of oligarchic society. Now, let me suggest to you what I think we should be doing in this country, just very briefly, because we can go on and on and on for it. First of all, we've got to recognize that we have a major jobs crisis. We have to put people back to work. Can never forget that. People struggling, people's lives being destroyed. I remember last year talking to a young lady, I'll never forget it, she was at Johnson State up in the northern part of the state. She says, I was the first person in my family to go to college. I'm working on a master's degree. I'm going to end up with $50,000 in debt, and I cannot find a decent paying job. And that story is being told in every state in this country. So how do we put people back to work? Let me suggest 3 or 4 things that I think we have got to do. And the reason I want to get into this is to tell you that it breaks my heart when I listen to the debates on television. You know, let me break the news to you, which you already know. Politics is not about zingers and one-liners and people who are funny, make funny jokes. Basically, what politics is about is how we develop the policies as a democratic society to move us forward. That's what it is. Okay? So let me talk a little bit about policy. For a start, you want to create millions of decent paying jobs and make this country more productive, you know what you do? You rebuild our crumbling infrastructure. That's what you do. And let me give you just a tiny local example of this, tiny. A couple of weeks ago, your local resident, Governor Shumlin, who's doing a great job in my mind, and I and others were in Brattleboro to commemorate the completion of the most significant improvement in Vermont rail that we have seen in a very, very long time. Federal government put over $50 million through the much maligned stimulus package, by the way, one of the most successful pieces of legislation passed in the modern history of this country, by the way. Put over $50 million into that, and this is what ends up happening. You now can get on a train in St. Albans. You can get off in Brattleboro in about 3.5 hours for $12. Not bad. And what we have got to do is do that all over the country, and we are. We are making progress. We have increased the speed in which trains can go, but here on this line, but we got a lot more to do. But it's not just rail. And in rail, as all of you know, we're way behind Europe, Japan, China, other countries. Okay. It is roads, it is bridges, it is water systems, it is wastewater plants, it is airports. If we invest in those areas of rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure, we create millions of jobs at all levels. We make this country more productive and more internationally competitive. So that's issue number 1. Issue number 2 has to do with getting money out to small and medium-sized businesses who are living in the productive economy, actually producing products. And that means that we have to tell Wall Street, while we break them up, that we cannot have financial institutions that are primarily gambling casinos. They have got to provide affordable loans to small and medium-sized businesses so they can create the jobs that we need. Third area, and again, on this area, I have to tell you, hasn't been a hell of a lot of difference between Republicans and Democrats. And that is, we need to rethink our disastrous trade policies. What do I mean by that? What I mean is trade is not a sexy issue, but it is enormously important. I was in the House in the early 1990s, and all of the big money interests, they came up with this NAFTA idea. And they said, it would be great. We're going to create all of these great jobs in America selling products to Mexico. And then later on, they came up with an even better idea, free trade with China. Think of that market in China. You got all these people, they're just dying for American products. Yeah. Story. I was in China 8-9 years ago. And we went to Walmart in China, which in many ways looks like Walmart in the United States. And if you walk around, what you find is a lot of American products. Yes, you do. A lot of American products are sold in Walmart in China. And the guy who was guiding us was a fellow who was the head of Asia at Walmart. And I said to him, I see a lot of American products here. That's very good. How many of these products are actually made in the United States of America? And he was very sheepish, didn't particularly want to respond, but he said about 1%, which makes, obvious common sense. The whole function of unfettered free trade was to allow corporate America to shut down in America, move to countries where they could pay people pennies an hour and bring their products back into this country. That's what it was. And here's the result. In the last 10 years in this country, we have lost 55,000 factories and millions of decent paying jobs. Are all of them attributable to trade? No. There are other reasons, obviously. But a lot of them are. And it's not hard to imagine. The head of General Electric, Jack Welch, you remember old Jack Welch? Jack said, and he was a very sharp businessman, I think they called him, what was it, Nuclear Jack or something. And what he said is, if I had my druthers as head of GE, I would like to build our manufacturing plants on barges. Why do you want them on barges? Because you go to that part of the world where wages are lowest. The guy who followed him is Jeff Immelt. And about 10 years ago, Immelt was speaking to GE investors, and he said, when I look at General Electric, I see the future of our company in China, 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 and China. And it is not just General Electric. Every major corporation that you can think of has engaged in massive outsourcing. And it's not hard to understand why. Why would they want to pay somebody in Vermont $20 an hour, provide health care, protect the environment, when you can go to other countries and pay people pennies an hour? Our current trade policies have failed. It is harder and harder to buy products manufactured in the United States of America. We need to fundamentally change those policies. Third, third area, which is enormously important, not only for jobs, but for saving the planet. If you were to ask me what embarrasses me most occasionally about being in the Congress, and a lot embarrasses me, it is this issue of global warming. Now, honest people can have honest differences about how we can best proceed to address this crisis. But when you have 98% of scientists who write about climate change agreeing, and who do peer-reviewed articles, and who agree that A, global warming is real, B, that it is significantly caused by human activity, C, that global warming, as all of you know, is already causing major damage in this country and around the world in terms of floods and droughts and extreme weather disturbances, and D, if we don't get our act together, it's only going to get worse. Okay? Now that's what the scientific community tells us. I am on both. I'm the only member of the Senate in the majority who's on both the Environmental and Energy Committee. So I listen to these scientists all of the time. That's what they say over and over. And then occasionally they come in and say, remember what we told you 4 years ago? We underestimated the problem. It is worse. We've got to move aggressively. In the Congress right now, in the Senate, you have a Republican Party in which I cannot name you one member who stands up and says global warming is real. I can't name you one. It may be, I just don't know him. What I will tell you, and this is how bad it is, if the Republicans, God forbid, gain control over the United States Senate, the gentleman, and that's a possibility, it's going to be close, the gentleman who will become chairman of the Environmental Committee, which has oversight for global warming, that's their area of jurisdiction, is a fellow named Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma. Jim has just written, and I know Jim very well, Jim has just written a book. He was kind enough to give me a copy of his book. Jim has written a book called The Greatest Hoax. And the book repeats what he has been saying for many, many years. Global warming is a huge hoax perpetrated, listen up to this, on the American people by Al Gore, the United Nations, and the Hollywood elite. That is global warming. Senator Inhofe will be chairman of the Environmental Committee if the Republicans win. So he's not an aberration. He's not just some guy who has a strange point of view. He is the leader of the Republicans on the issue of global warming. Now, that's the very bad news. Here's the good news. The good news is we know right now, and as technology improves, it will only get better. We know how to make America the leader in reversing global warming internationally. And when we do it, we can create a huge number of jobs. How do you do it? For a start, in our state and all over America, there are older buildings, maybe one like this, I don't know, where when it gets cold, heat goes through the windows, goes through the roof, goes through the doors. We have put in this state, and I'm very happy to have passed a major piece of legislation bringing millions of dollars into the state for weatherization. And you know what that means? This is what it means. I had a meeting last year with two very lovely women from Barre, Vermont, who were in their 80s, sisters, and they lived together. And they said after their home was weatherized, their fuel bill went down by 40 or 50%. That's happening all over the state. But it's not only their fuel bills going down, greenhouse gas emissions are going down as well. So what we can do is create a huge number of jobs, retrofitting older buildings throughout this country. And there's some really great news there. We brought some money into the state in Rutland to take what was an old Catholic school. Hadn't been occupied for years. It was an eyesore in West Rutland. Put some money into it for affordable housing, and it was built in such a way that their fuel bill was 80% less than otherwise would have been the case. So we know how to do this. We can save consumers money and cut greenhouse gas emissions, put people to work, not only doing the insulation and retrofitting, but also manufacturing the products that are required. But it's not just energy efficiency. It is also a movement toward such sustainable energies as wind, solar, geothermal, and biomass. And despite what Mr. Romney may tell you, we have been enormously successful. And Obama and his people deserve credit for this. We have a very good Secretary of Energy in Stephen Chu. We work closely with him. And what that is about is that the cost of solar panels has plummeted, much cheaper than used to be the case. In wind, in America now, in Texas, they are producing wind energy for electricity as the equivalent of 10 nuclear power plants. All right, that's what they're doing. And it's not only Texas, Iowa, other states, 20% of their electricity is now coming from wind, and in our state, in a year or two, it'll be about 11%. We can do better. So the point is, if we understand that global warming is a planetary crisis, if we understand that we need to put our people back to work, there's no better way that I can think of than transforming our energy system away from fossil fuels, coal, oil, etc., into energy efficiency and sustainable energy. This is a win-win-win situation. So we're going to work very hard on that issue. Let me touch now on an issue that is going to get a whole lot of attention the day after the election. And that is deficit reduction. As we speak right now, I can tell you with 100% certainty, because I know who these guys are, there are a group of folks, Republicans and Democrats, meeting with CEOs of large corporations, figuring out a deficit reduction plan. Now, I want to take you back 11 years to January of 2001, January 2001. In that moment in history, Bill Clinton was leaving office and George W. Bush assumed power as president. At that moment, this country had a $236 billion surplus. Got it? That's a large surplus. And all of the economists were telling us that that surplus was going to grow. Okay? 11 years fast forward, we're here in 2012, we have a $1 trillion deficit, and we have a $16 trillion national debt. Serious business. Question for you. How do we go from a $236 billion surplus to a $1 trillion deficit? Oh. Okay. Now here's the, all right, you got the answer. That was good. Smart group. point that I want to make here is what really upsets me and should upset all of you is the absolute hypocrisy of many of these folks like Paul Ryan who claim to be very worried about the deficit. Right? Now, if they, and George W. Bush and all of these guys were so worried about the deficit, why in God's name do they go into two wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, which will end up costing us over $3 trillion and not pay one nickel for those wars? All right, that's number one. Okay, number two, these guys who stay up nights and give great speeches on the floor of the Senate about what the deficit will mean to our kids and our grandchildren. I've heard that speech 100 times. Okay, they gave $1 trillion in tax breaks to the wealthiest people in this country, and they forgot to pay for that. Just, we all go to the grocery store and we forget to buy something. They just forgot to pay for $1 trillion worth of tax breaks. And the third thing these guys did is when Bush was having some political problems, they passed a Medicare Part D prescription drug program written by the insurance companies and the drug companies that, in language, makes it impossible for the government and Medicare to negotiate drug prices with the pharmaceutical industry. That'll cost $400 billion over 10 years, and I know I will shock you once again that the great conservative deficit hawks who worry so much about the deficit and the national debt, once again it just slipped their mind, forgot to pay for that. Last point I would make about the deficit, which is not talked about virtually at all. When you are in the midst of a terrible recession, it is not just that people are unemployed. It's not just that people have lost their homes or their life savings. What also happens when people are unemployed and not paying taxes, when businesses go under and not paying taxes, the revenue coming into the federal government goes way down. So today, at 15.2% of our GDP, revenue coming into the federal government is at the lowest point that it has been in 60 years. Got that? So less revenue coming in, you're paying for two wars, tax breaks for the rich, it adds up. And guess what? That is the reason, to a very significant degree, that we have the deficit today. All right? Now, what my Republican friends will say, well, Bernie, you may be right. Maybe we should have paid for the wars. Maybe we should not have given huge tax breaks. But be that as it may, we are where we are, and you'll have to admit that we have a serious problem right now that has to be dealt with. All right? Okay, and what is their plan? And now, what is taking place, all of this, not all of this, but a lot of this obviously will be dependent, what happens will be dependent on who wins the White House, who controls the Senate, and so forth. But this is what virtually all Republicans and some Democrats would like to see. For a start, these guys want to cut Social Security. Now, you don't hear a whole lot about it. So I'm telling you what is absolutely true. Everybody inside the Beltway knows it, but the media forgets to tell the American people about this. No ifs, buts, and maybes, they want to cut Social Security. Now, if somebody gets up in front of a TV camera and says, look, we got $1 trillion deficit, and it may be painful, but we are going to have to cut Social Security. No, they don't say cut Social Security. They call it entitlement reform. So whenever you hear anybody talking about entitlement reform, that's code language for cutting Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, okay? That's the translation. Now, if somebody says we've got to cut Social Security because we have a huge deficit, what is wrong, factually incorrect about that statement? Who knows?
It's an insurance program.
Okay. What is wrong about that statement is Social Security has not contributed one nickel to the deficit. How's that? Social Security is funded by that 6.2% you guys pay in your paycheck every month. It is funded by the payroll tax, 6.2 from the worker, 6.2 from the employer. Okay? Not funded by the general treasury. Number two, this will shock you. You're not going to see this on Fox TV terribly often. Social Security today has a $2.7 trillion surplus, in case you didn't hear me, surplus. Number three, Social Security can pay out every benefit owed to every eligible American for the next 21 years. What we want, and what actuaries want, is to make Social Security strong for 75 years, not 21. And we've got to do that. And we have a plan on how to do that. But in any case, Social Security has a surplus, hasn't contributed to a deficit. Now, you may ask me, well, why do they want to cut Social Security? And the answer, certainly from the Republican perspective, is the reason you want to cut Social Security, if you're a right-wing Republican, is because Social Security has been the most successful federal program in the modern history of the United States. It has done exactly and more than what the people who developed that program in the 30s hoped it would do. Before Social Security, 50% of seniors lived in poverty. That's your grandparents, your great-grandparents, lived in desperate poverty. Today, that number is too high. It is 9%. Today, if somebody you know has a disability, that person can live in dignity because of Social Security. Today, if some guy goes to work or some woman goes to work and drops dead on the job, leaving a spouse and kids home, that family can live in dignity because of the widows and orphans provision in there. The problem here is we take Social Security for granted. For 77 years, in good economic times and bad, Social Security has paid out every nickel owed to every eligible American. During this Wall Street recession, when the stock market crashed, millions of people lost their life savings. Not one person in America during that crash received a letter from the Social Security Administration saying, sorry, Mary, we have to cut your benefits in half because of the bad economy. People got 100% of what they are owed. The gentleman here is right. Social Security is an insurance program. It has worked phenomenally well with modest administrative costs. And because it has been so successful, because it is an example of what government can do, for those people who hate government, they want to destroy Social Security. Okay? But it is not just Social Security. These guys want to go after Medicare. They want to go after Medicaid and other programs very important for the middle class and working families of our country. Further, what they want to do at a time when the wealthiest people are doing phenomenally well, they want to do what Romney is talking about and lower tax rates for the wealthiest people in this country under the trickle-down theory that once you do that, you're going to stimulate the economy and more tax revenue comes in. Now, in my view, and I am chairman of a caucus, what we call a caucus in Senate called the Defending Social Security Caucus. So I am going to do everything that I can. And this is going to hit the front pages the day after the election. I'm going to do everything that I can to make sure that, yes, we move toward deficit reduction, but we don't do it on the backs of the elderly, the children, the sick, or the poor. Now, how do you do that? How do you do that? Well, for a start, the right-wing hypocrites and Romney say, yeah, I'm really concerned about the deficit, but it is absolutely imperative that we continue Bush's tax breaks for the top 2%. Just killing that is $1 trillion that we've saved over a 10-year period. But that's not all. At a time when we have the kind of wealth and income inequality in America, it is absolutely appropriate for us to say to the wealthiest people in this country, sorry, welcome to America. You are going to have to help us deal with the deficit, not just a struggling middle class. Today in America, you don't know this, most of you don't, 1 out of 4 profitable corporations pays nothing in taxes. A few years ago, ExxonMobil, which is probably the most profitable corporation in history, went through a year where they made billions in profit. Not only did they not pay any federal taxes, they actually got a rebate from the IRS because of all of the loopholes and everything else. It is estimated that we are losing about $100 billion every year, that's serious money, through the tax havens that exist in the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and Panama, and other countries. There is a photograph, which one of these days I'm going to bring back to Vermont. It is of, we have it on the Budget Committee. It is a picture of a 5-story building in the Cayman Islands. And it's not any different than, one of your larger buildings here in Putney. It's a 5-story, all right, it's a little bit bigger. I'm from Burlington, all right, we have big buildings here. But it's a 5-story building, and you know how many occupants it has? 18,000. 18,000 separate corporations call this building their home. Now, you might think that it gets awfully crowded in a modest 5-story building with 18,000 companies, but don't worry, it does not get crowded, because the whole thing is a fraud. And all that this is that companies are using that address, that mailing address, as their residency in the Cayman Islands in order to avoid paying taxes to the United States and other countries. So it seems to me, I know radical though I may be, that before you throw children off of health insurance or deny food to hungry Americans, maybe we end that tax absurdity. And last, if we're talking about sensible ways to do deficit reduction, you've got to take a hard look at military spending. And that is that right now we're spending about $700 billion a year on the military. That is 3 times what we spent in 1997 and almost as much as the rest of the world combined. In Europe, say countries like France and Germany, that provide health care to all of their people as a right, that provide virtually free or very low-cost college education, they spent about 2% of their GDP on defense. We spend 4%. So I think it is not necessary for us to have to defend the entire world. I think there are weapon systems that were designed to fight the Soviet Union, which, as some of you may know, no longer exists. So I think we can make judicious cuts in military spending. The point being, you add all those things up, there are ways to do deficit reduction without making devastating cuts that will cause a lot of suffering in this country, and that's what we should be working on. Last point that I want to make, and we'll open it up, 2 more points. I always say last point, is that I want to talk a little bit about politics in America and tell you this is what I think that is going on. And it gives me no joy to have to tell you this, but I think very few people will, so I may as well be the one to do it. We had, historically in this, have had in this country a 2-party system, Republicans and Democrats. And as all of you know, in this state, for example, we have had Republican leaders like your own George Aiken. We've had people like Bob Stafford of Rutland, Jim Jeffords, Shrewsbury. We've had governors like Dick Snelling, Dean Davis. You've had a lot of Republican leaders who are what we call moderate Republicans. I didn't agree with them. I'm not going to here to tell you that I agreed with Jim Jeffords. I didn't. But these were people who lived in the real world. These were people who were concerned about education, concerned about the environment, concerned about women's issues. Those people, those Vermont Republican leaders, and people like Dwight David Eisenhower, President of the United States, they would no longer be welcome or feel comfortable in today's Republican Party. It is today a right-wing extremist party, getting further and further right. As you all remember, Jim Jeffords preceded me. I took his seat. And Jeffords will go down. And I want to, I like Jim personally, always have. But politically, we had our strong differences. But Jeffords will go down in history as being the only sitting member of the Congress to finally say, hey, I can't stay in that party anymore. I'm out. All right? That was an act of courage. And yet today's Republican Party is far to the right of what it was when Jeffords became an independent. Let me just talk a little bit about what the Republican Party is today. And I'm not exaggerating. As I mentioned earlier, at a time when the middle class is in decline and the wealthiest people are doing phenomenally well, these guys, and that's what the Paul Ryan budget is about, want to make drastic reductions in nutrition programs, in education programs, environmental programs. They want to transform Medicare from the program it is today to a voucher program. The Ryan budget wants to cut over $700 billion in a 10-year period from Medicaid, throwing millions and millions of working people and children off of Medicaid. All right? And then they want to give tax breaks to millionaires and billionaires. But it's not just economics. I mentioned to you about global warming. Global warming is probably the major environmental crisis facing this planet. They refuse to accept the science of that. And as I mentioned, somebody like Jim Inhofe, who thinks global warming is a hoax, will become chairman of the Environmental Committee. And do you think there are any Republicans who are going to stand up and say, gee, maybe Inhofe should not be allowed to become chairman? You know, it's a little weird. There will not be one. If the Republicans win, Inhofe will become chairman. Third point, when you talk about extremism, and we don't discuss this enough for reasons that will be obvious to you in a moment. The Republicans, as you all know, had their convention when Romney and Ryan were nominated in Tampa, Florida. There is a plank in their party platform which says the following, and there wasn't a whole lot of debate about it, that they want to see a constitutional amendment, pretty radical act unto itself, a constitutional amendment which will ban abortion in America in all circumstances. If a woman is raped, if a woman is a victim of incest, if a woman's health does not allow her to give birth to a baby, it doesn't matter. So a woman, under their understanding of freedom, a woman who was raped must have the rapist's baby, even at the expense of her own health or life. And that didn't get a whole lot of debate. That's out there. That's Paul Ryan's views. Romney says that's not quite his views. That's Paul Ryan's views, a guy who could become vice president of the United States. So what we have seen over the last number of years, because of the success of the Tea Party and other groups, is a taking of a historically great party, founded by Abraham Lincoln and those guys, and moved it to a far-right party. And what about the Democrats? Well, let me tell you about the Democrats. I caucus with the Democrats, so don't tell them I said this, all right? The Democratic Party once was generally regarded, say in the 30s and 40s, as the party of the working class of America. Anybody think the Democratic Party is the party of the working class of America today? Very few people do. Very few people do. In fact, they lose the working class vote. More working class people vote Republican than Democrat. The Democratic Party is significantly dominated by money as well. You have some great people in the Democratic Party. And by the way, I hope very much, somebody I guess will be up here in a moment to talk about it, that we're going to elect one of the best in Elizabeth Warren in Massachusetts. A very good friend of mine, Sherrod Brown, is running in Ohio. They are spending against Sherrod something like $20 million in Citizens United type money. So you must appreciate that he is a good senator. They're willing to spend $20 million trying to do, but he's going to win, we think. So you got some great Democrats there who are fighting for working families and working very, very hard. But on the other hand, you got Democrats there who are really not a whole lot different than Republicans. And if I talk, as I talked about tonight, issues like, I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings who is active in the Democratic Party, but if we talk about deregulation of Wall Street, you know who signed that bill? Bill Clinton. If you talked about NAFTA, you know who signed that bill? Clinton. And I thought Clinton, by and large, was a pretty good president. Seriously. But what ends up happening on the major issues, parties come together on behalf of big money. And you're seeing this now in terms of deficit reduction. Corporate money is saying to Republicans and Democrats, you're going to have to come together and cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. That's the only way we can deal with the deficit. So you've got a Republican Party that has moved very far to the right, and a Democratic Party that has moved from what I would call a left-center party to a centrist party, significantly influenced by corporate money, while having some really great members. That's where we are. And I think many of you say, all right, well, you know, that's a difficult moment. What do we do? Now, some people in the country, I do a radio show every Friday, and every week I get calls, I'm disgusted with the Democrats, I'm disgusted with them. That's not a good answer. The answer is, the immediate task right now is to defeat Romney and Ryan and right-wing extremism. But that's not enough. So what we need to do is the day after the election is continue to work to build a national, strong, progressive grassroots movement that says to the President, Obama, that says to the Democratic Congress, start paying attention to the needs of the middle class, stand up to the Republicans, stand up to Wall Street, and if you do the right thing, we will be behind you. So that is our task. Our task is not only to re-elect the president and make sure that we do not have a Republican Senate or House, if that's possible, but it's to really galvanize the American people and have millions of people standing up and saying, sorry, you ain't going to cut Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid or the WIC program or food stamps, but you are going to ask your campaign contributors to start paying more in taxes. And when millions of people stand together, we can make that happen. Yes. All right? Now, in fact, my wife always tells me that I should distribute Prozac at the end of my speeches, because I depress everybody. So I want to leave you with what I think is very good news, and some very positive developments. And I say this not just because I happen to be a U.S. Senator from the state of Vermont, but we live, and you know, I am blessed, if you like, to go around the state. I go all over the state. We've had meetings in these tiny towns up in the Northeast Kingdom. I know more people come to these meetings than live in the town. I don't know how that happens, but you know, we have a great state. We have a great state. And this is the role that every person in this room can play. Now, I don't know what's going to happen in the election, and I don't know what Congress is going to end up doing or not doing on the important issues, but this is what I know we can do as a small state. You know, we may be a small state, but we are a state. And if we do something, the other 49 states looks at the state of Vermont and says, maybe a good idea. So what can we do to play a profound role in the modern history of this country? Number one, we can be the first state in the United States of America to pass a Medicare for all single-payer program. And your neighbor, the governor, is under a lot of pressure right now from the corporate interest and big money who do not want him to go forward. But he's standing tall, and I'm proud of that. I'm going to work with him. And if we pass a Medicare for all single-payer program, you do a couple of things. First of all, I want you to take a deep breath and think about it. You take the anxiety of health care off the backs of hundreds of thousands of people. Now imagine that you don't have to worry that when you get sick, you don't have enough money to walk into a doctor's office, which takes place every single day. You know, I'm very proud of our efforts in that direction. But it will not only be important for the individual, it will be important for the small and medium-sized business community, because they're spending now a significant part of their revenue flow on healthcare. Maybe they should pay attention dealing with the products and the services they're supposed to deal with, not having to worry about health care. Third, and maybe most important area, if the state of Vermont is successful in implementing a universal health care system that is cost effective, if you think that the rest of the country is not going to be looking at what Vermont does, you are wrong. We can be a model for where America goes on health care. We can be the start of a national health care system which guarantees health care to all people as a right. That is a big, big deal. Second of all, we are and must continue to be a leader in the issue of civil rights and civil liberties, treating all people, regardless of their sexual orientation or their gender, with the respect and equality that they deserve. And why is that important? I mean, it's not only important in the sense of human dignity. I'll tell you what else. If you think there are not young couples all over America who are having kids, and who are saying, you know what? I do not want to raise my kid or my children in a homophobic, sexist society. I'm going to move to the state of Vermont. I am deadly serious. I am deadly serious. You create a climate where our state becomes a leader, not only on health care, but environment, women's rights, education, on all of those issues. We become a mecca for people all over this country. And it will make our economy and our standard of living even better. So, I am very optimistic about the future of this state, not only on health care, not only on energy, not only on civil rights and civil liberties, on agriculture. We've got a lot of young people going back to agriculture, producing vegetables. We've got a lot of growth in organics. We have growth in CSAs, farmers markets. We have great institutions like the Putney Co-op, the Brattleboro Co-op, all over the state. We're seeing that stuff. So we got a lot of work in front of us, and I don't want to overdo it and paint the picture that is rosier than it is. We've got a lot of work in front of us. But if we can do what I believe we can do here in the state of Vermont, we can be a model for the United States of America, and in that way, play a profound role in changing the direction of this country. So this small state has the opportunity to lead America in a very different direction, and let's rise up and make sure that that happens. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you. This is Vermont, not Washington. We don't need standing ovations. So you got a glass of water there or something? Okay, Phil, raise your hand. And who else? Okay, we got, all right, Phil, you want to start with the question? Yeah. We got two mics going around.
Hi, my name is Nancy Stenberg, and I came up tonight from Massachusetts with my colleagues Ray Janowski and Andrew Bowden from the Warren campaign. And thank you, Senator, for your great words about Elizabeth Warren. We're here to ask for your help. As you know, this is probably the most watched race in the country, and if we get Elizabeth Warren in there, we'll be helping President Obama and helping your great senator here. So we are here with some sheets to ask if next weekend, the 27th, if you're not doing anything else, you might want to come down to Massachusetts and do some canvassing or make some phone calls for Elizabeth Warren. We have plenty of offices in the western part of the state, so you don't have to drive to Boston, because you know there is another part of the state of Massachusetts. If you don't want to go to Massachusetts, maybe you might want to go to Keene, New Hampshire, and canvass or phone call for the president. And those people that we have in Massachusetts that usually do that could stay home and work for Elizabeth Warren. So for those of you who are leaving, we have sign-up sheets on the table out back. And if you're going to be staying for question and answers, we'll be passing some clipboards around. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And if anyone feels that they can do it, I really would urge you to do it. In fact, I'm going to be in Massachusetts on the 28th, going around the state on behalf of Elizabeth. I've known Elizabeth for many, many years. In fact, we brought her up here for a couple of town meetings, and she is incredibly smart and certainly will be one of the progressive leaders in the Congress. So let's do everything we can to elect Elizabeth. Okay, other questions or comments? Liz, you got somebody? Okay, ma'am, stand up if you could.
Hi. Wow. I'm Barbara Bruno from Westminster, and I just was going to tell you that this summer I went up to Fort Number 4 there in Charlestown, and the man that was all dressed up in his revolutionary uniform that took us around, he said that he was from Wisconsin, and that he had moved to this area because he said he couldn't breathe in Wisconsin because of the fracking. And I was really shocked at the way that he described it. And I wanted to know what you thought about fracking, because it scares the hell out of me.
Well, I'm against...
And also...
well, let me just answer that question, because a lot of people, I think, are going to want to ask questions. But let me just answer that. You made 2 points. First point is you backed up just what I said a moment ago, is that people are prepared to come to this state, a state that protects its environment. And we've got to continue to do that. And understand, protecting the environment is obviously important unto itself. You really don't need another explanation. But the truth is that when you have an environmentally clean state, it is also good for the economy. Okay? In terms of fracking, needless to say, I am opposed to it.
I had 2 quick things I wanted to say. One, you mentioned about Paul Ryan and the controlling women and the anti-abortionists. I just with a comment about that. If they want you to have that baby, or they want the woman to have that baby, when that baby is born, they don't want to do anything about it at that point. The other quick thing is why these supposed pro-business people aren't being taken to task with the Medicaid prescription drug program, where they put that stipulation in concerning the lack of ability to negotiate price.
Right. Well, your point is well taken. I mean, it is the utmost in vulgarity and hypocrisy. Some of you may have seen Ryan in an emergency food shelf. You see that? Cleaning clean pots. These are the guys that want to decimate those programs. They really do. And in terms of Medicare, here's a huge issue. I talked to, well, I'll give you 2 stories on that. A couple of years ago, I talked to a doctor in Underhill, Vermont, I believe. Milton, Vermont. And she told me that about 40% of the prescriptions she writes for her working class patients are not filled because the price of the drugs is so high. So getting drug costs under control, understanding why the prices that we pay in the United States are far higher than any other country on earth. Some of you may recall, I don't know if you do. I took a couple of busloads of women a number of years ago from Franklin County over the Canadian border into Montreal. Now, I'll never forget this as long as I live. These women were dealing with breast cancer, working class women. Walked into Montreal, and we had this all planned out. They went into a drugstore. They bought tamoxifen, which was a widely prescribed breast cancer drug, at 1/10 the price they were paying in Vermont. Now, out of that whole business, ended up millions of people now buying their medicine in Canada. But it is a serious healthcare problem that people cannot afford the prescription drugs they need. It is clearly an outrage and a total giveaway to the drug companies that Medicare, unlike, by the way, the Veterans Administration and the Department of Defense, they negotiate prices with the drug companies. Medicare cannot. We are wasting billions of dollars because that is an issue we're going to work on. Last point I want to make on this issue. Listen to this. We had a hearing on this. It was a really informative hearing. We focused on AIDS, but the issue goes well beyond AIDS. And this is what we found. Probably the one good thing that I can recall that George W. Bush did, weren't many, but one good thing that he did, is he responded to the AIDS community, world community, and worked with Congress to develop a program called PEPFAR, which means that the federal government, your tax dollars, are going to buy generic drugs for AIDS in Africa and other countries. And Bill Clinton has been involved independently. The result is that millions and millions and millions of people are alive today who otherwise would not be alive. It has been widely regarded as a success story. Now here's the funny thing. The United States government buys what we call Tripla, which is it's the AIDS cocktail. If you have HIV, this is what you take. If you were to go to a drugstore in Vermont, it would cost you $25,000 a year for that treatment. If you're a state government, you're going to get it for less than $25,000, but you're going to pay a lot for it. The United States government buys the exact same product, government buys it, to use in developing countries, not for $25,000, but for less than $200. You got it? So in America, there are individuals who are paying $25,000 for the same product that is being made by Indian generic drug companies and sold for less than $200. So this is a huge issue, one that we are working on. I don't want to give you a long speech about it. But the bottom line is we need to change the way we do research and development with regard to prescription drugs. If a drug, look, there are enough illnesses out there that cannot be treated, and we all have had friends and relatives who have died. But if people can be treated with a drug, it is grossly immoral to say to that person, I'm sorry you have to die because you can't pay what the drug companies want you to pay for that medicine. So the goal is to fund research and development through the governments of the world, and when that product hits, when that product is developed that can save lives, get it out to the people of the world in a generic fashion. It's a big deal. Okay, a few more questions. Okay, Liz, you got somebody? Okay, sir.
Yeah, Bernie, my name is Tom Santos, and I live in Brattleboro. If Social Security is a trust fund, which I'm pretty sure it is, who gives anybody the right to pay for wars or whatever else they're using it for? Why don't they pay it back? Now, if they paid this back, we wouldn't have any problem with Social Security. It'd be, there forever.
Okay. All right, Tom, let me tell you as best I can what I think the situation is, because what you said is not quite accurate. Now, what is accurate is Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson, in order to disguise the cost of the Vietnam War, they combined the budgets. Okay? But that doesn't mean there's not a separate accounting system. What Social Security Administration does, as they should, they don't put the $2.7 trillion under the president's mattress. What they do is they invest that money at decent interest rates, to the degree that they are decent, in treasury bonds, and they earn significant amounts of money. So the point is that we do have a Social Security trust fund. It is administered separately. It has a $2.7 trillion surplus, and it earns interest every year through investment in the Treasury fund. Now, the problem is that we have enough money in the fund to pay out everybody's benefit for the next 21 years, at which point the trust fund would lose all of its money. All of its money would be gone. What we would then be in a situation is Social Security would pay out about 75% of the benefits from money coming in and then going out. So what we have to do is in 21 years, Tom, we need to figure out a way to deal with that 25% gap. And you know how we do that? 4 years ago, when Barack Obama ran for the president, this is what he said. He said that I believe that we should lift the cap on taxable income. I don't know if you know this, Tom, but right now, it's just gone up recently. If somebody makes $113,000 a year, they pay on that $113,000. If you make $1 billion a year, you pay on $113,000. If you lift that cap And you don't have to start at 113. You can go up to 250, start at 250, and then ask millionaires and people making huge sums on it. If you do that, your problem is solved for 75 years. I've introduced legislation to do just that. Yep.
Hi, I'm Jackie. I live in Brattleboro.
You are Jackie, I know that.
My question is about global warming and starvation. And I wonder if, recently I went to a talk where, I'll make a long story short, the guy talked about World War II and how people, the totality, yeah, that people were easy prey to totalitarianism, that's the word, because of starvation, which we forget about. And he mentioned this wonderful talk led in the end for him to say that he thought the most important issue now is global warming, because when the calorie is no longer available, there's going to be horrible things going around worldwide in terms of war and etc. So I would like to know if
Jackie,
talking about that.
Yes. In fact, interestingly enough, Jackie, you know who agrees with you? The CIA and the Department of Defense. That's true. They believe that global warming, just as you said, look, if you have flooding and if you have droughts, and if people can't grow the food that they need, you're going to have economic and political instability, right? You're going to have people going to war for limited and scarce resources. CIA sees that as a major national security issue. So you're absolutely right.
I understand that J.P. Morgan runs the electronic benefit card, so they get a cut of every swipe of that card, the food stamp program, which I think is offshore to India, and also for the food inflation. I think the number one driver is Goldman Sachs, the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, and also the J.P. Morgan Trading Desk, because they make a derivative out of food. The more money that goes into the funds, the more the food goes up. So that's, I think, the number one driver of the food inflation. And then I read in the Wall Street Journal that there was a call from the 50 smaller banks around the country, because the amendment to Basel III, they want the smaller banks to have more money on the books for lending, and these banks weren't really, in so much of the, making so much, what's the word? Anyway, so it's the central banks dictating policy to the smaller banks, wanting them more money on the books when they weren't really the cause of all these derivatives and things like that. So you haven't addressed, I haven't heard much about the central bank policy, dictating policy.
Well, I'm not going to go into great length on that. Thank you. That's a good question. I would simply say that we need, at the very least, major reform of the Fed. Okay, what do I mean by that? One of the achievements that I'm proudest of is that during the financial reform bill, the so-called Dodd-Frank bill, which was not a strong bill, it was a modest bill, we got a provision in there which, for the first time, did an audit of the Fed during the emergency financial period. And you know what we learned? This is what we learned. And I'm on the budget committee. Ben Bernanke did not want to make this public, but we forced him to do that. This is what we learned. During the financial crisis, the Fed lent out at zero or near zero interest rates in a revolving loan process, $16 trillion to every major financial institution in this country, to central banks all over the world, and to many corporations in America and wealthy individuals. When Bernanke came before the budget committee, this is before we learned all that, I said, I understand that you're lending out money, and this is what I said. I thought it was very amusing. He didn't think so. I said, can you tell the people of my state what 1-800 number they should call in order to get these zero interest loans? He doesn't have a great sense of humor. He didn't think that was too funny. And all right, to make a long story short, that is what we learned. So the issue for me, without going into great detail now, just one other point that we're trying to work on. We introduced an amendment. Here's the story. In terms of our central bank is the Fed. And Bernanke is the chairman of it. You'll all be delighted to know that one of the responsibilities of the Fed is to regulate Wall Street. And what we have right now on the books is that for regional Feds, like the New York Fed, 3 of their members comes from Wall Street itself. One of them is Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan Chase. So radical that I am, I thought that that might appear, maybe, to be a modest conflict of interest, that the head of the largest bank in America sat on the board that regulates the large banks. Crazy as I may be, that's what I thought. You know how many co-sponsors we got on an amendment to end that? 2. And that's the power of Wall Street. All right, maybe one more question. Phil or Liz, you got one over there? Okay. Yes, sir.
Bernie, I'm Michael Krasner from Westminster. There's a pretty good case to be made that the results of the 2004 election in Ohio were affected by outright fraud. I wonder if you're at all concerned about a repetition of that in this year's election?
Well, obviously, we are. I suspect the Obama people will do everything that they can. I think there's going to be a full employment for lawyers in the next few weeks, and they're going to be in polling places all over this country. Yeah, of course we're concerned. But I'll tell you what I'm more concerned about. Not just, the possibility of fraud. What I am really, look, I'm in politics. I've been in politics for many years. I've seen a lot of things. And I've won in elections where I've run hard and I've lost, and sometimes I win. But, it never occurred to me, nor do I think to most people, to say, well, one way to win the election is to make sure that people who might vote against you aren't allowed to vote. Never occurred to me. But it has occurred to Republican governors and legislators and operators. And as you know, and we've gotten some halfway decent court decisions recently to roll this stuff back, but all over this country, what Republicans are trying to do is to make it difficult for lower income people, for seniors, for folks that don't have a driver's license to actually participate in the political process. That is ugly stuff. And, we've been working with the Obama administration to get that stuff rolled back. Okay, last question. Liz, you got somebody there? Okay.
My name is Jaime Susbach. I live in Westminster. Been there for 4 years, by the way, and this will be the second time I will have the privilege of voting for you. I'd like to take you back to one of the largest expense items on our national budget. You mentioned it yourself, defense. You seem to be one of the very few politicians who doesn't regard defense as a sacred cow or a golden calf dance run. You would be willing to cut it.
Yes.
50 years ago next week, I was an infantryman confronting the Warsaw Pact about 3 miles from the eastern border in what was called the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think historians nowadays regard that as the closest we ever got to the point of nuclear war.
Yes.
My understanding is that nowadays we are quite a bit away from that. And there are many, many other dangers that we face, which are not necessarily the type of danger that you confront with tanks and missiles and submarines and aircraft carriers.
Right.
Suggestion. Why don't we, as you suggest, cut the Defense Department down to a decent size where it will be able to conduct war if it be absolutely necessary, rename it the War Department, which it used to be, and take the rest of the money and create a peace department.
Yeah. Well, the essence of what you're saying is that in the long run, it's funny how these things always come around. I'm chairman of the subcommittee on primary health care. And what we know is when you invest in primary health care and disease prevention, not only does it keep people healthier and happier, it saves the system money. And in a sense, what you're talking about is the same thing. If we can get at the root causes of war, poverty, hatred, and it's not easy stuff, let me tell you something, because you got some folks out there who do what they do. if we invest in that, at the end of the day, we not only create a more peaceful world, we end up saving money as well. And I certainly agree with that. There's some great programs. I've gone around the world. You'd be surprised and delighted at some great programs the USAID does, working with, I was in Egypt some years ago, you know, working with really impoverished women, making loans, microloans of a couple of $100s, allowing these women to get a sewing machine, raise their family. I mean, for them, 200 is like $1 million to you. So we've done some good things, but clearly we have a whole lot to do. And I'll tell you what else I think we should do. When I was mayor of Burlington, we started a bunch of, not a bunch, but several sister city programs where we brought, you know, people in and we sent people abroad. I think that also helps create a more peaceful world. Pretty inexpensive way for people to get to know each other rather than hating each other. So I think your point is a very good one. All right, let me just conclude by thanking all of you for being here tonight, and just reiterate that we have the opportunity, I think, in this state, if we do the right things, if we participate in the political process, you know, if we get involved from the school board to the board of select persons, whatever it may be, we have the opportunity to do extraordinary things in the state. And when we do that, it is not only a wonderful thing for our 630,000 people, we become a model for this country. So we've got a lot of work to do. These are tough times for our country. Let's go forward together, and I thank you all very much for being here.